Hello, hello, and welcome all to In Time. My name is Nicholas Soutter, and I am here, as always, with my favorite, and I really do mean this, my favorite hat of all time, and it's person Ansgar.
Well, thank you. My hat appreciates it, and so does the person.
Oh, good, good, good.
Honored to do this show with you, truly.
Oh, well, thank you. Same here. So we hope everyone is having a good day. We're sorry that we got a little delayed, but we are here with King Crocoduck, which we've been looking forward to, and we're going to talk with him in a minute. But first, just wanted to let you know, if you want to do any super chats, you will find the links to the super chat at the top of the description. We are simulcasting to the GDC. If you want to find our channel, you can go and subscribe to that. We're actually, Ansgar, what's the number? Did you look at where we are?
We are at 986 subscribers.
Oh, wow. So that's we hope if you like the show, you'll subscribe. Join us from the GDC. We usually simulcast to the GDC. Breaking news doesn't always show up there. Sometimes we just do that on our channel. Also, if you like the show, you can find a link to our Patreon. We do special Patreon hangouts, and they discuss future guests with us, and that's always a lot of fun. And I don't know. I think that's about it. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it. Oh, we do have we don't mention it often. We do have a merch store that's linked in the description, Teespring. And our guests' links will also be in the description.
Uh, Absolutely. Thank you. So, and our
Mhm.
guest is King Crocoduck. King Crocoduck, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And sorry again about the little fiasco with the time. That was entirely my fault. I do apologize.
Well, I was going to be polite and only slander you behind your back on that. I wasn't going to actually like say it publicly.
Oh, sorry for ruining the mojo then.
It's all right. Don't worry. I told everyone it was your fault. But no, so we're very pleased you could make it and that this could work out. And by the way, and I forgot to mention this too, we are going to be having an after show. The after show will only be on the In Time channel, so you have to go to youtube.com/In Time Show if you want to, or if you're just seeing us on In Time, you'll see it about 5 minutes after we close out the show. We're going to do the after show. King Crocoduck will be available. You can come, you can ask him your questions, chat, hang out with us, and it should be a lot of fun.
And make sure that
So,
you follow our links in the description to the Discord, which is where we will be connecting people to King Crocoduck.
yep, absolutely. King Crocoduck, you're here. We're going to be discussing some significant challenges to sort of the fundamental principles of science. And so I wanted to know just a little bit more about who you are. If you could tell us, a bit more about who you are and what you do before we get started.
Sure, I'm a YouTuber with a modest following, and I teach science and debunk pseudoscience. There's a decent bit of discussion about the philosophy of science and about academia more generally. And in my professional capacity, I'm a biomedical physicist, a graduate student, but I also publish research and I also teach at the university level. Um, so that's sort of the long and short of it.
Yes, so you know something about science. um,
A little bit,
a
the
little
bits and
bit.
pieces here and there.
So what we're talking about is really, I think, a kind of epistemology, an epistemological change. So could you please define for us first epistemology, because I think that's going to become very relevant here, and then feminist epistemology, which is also, I think, going to be central to what we're discussing.
Sure. So epistemology generally is a philosophical field concerned with theories of truth, or more specifically, theories of knowledge. I happen to think that those are tied together, but there are some theories of knowledge, as we'll see, that don't necessarily tie truth to knowledge. Um, and chiefly among them that we'll be discussing today is feminist epistemology, which is it was first introduced in the 1980s. It had several people developing it, but I think the most relevant person in the story is someone named Sandra Harding, who is at UCLA, uh, and she developed what is the current incarnation of what's called standpoint epistemology. Now, traditionally, within a Marxist framework, a standpoint epistemology was relegated to the domain of workers versus the bourgeoisie. So, a kind of a kind of a popular story that gets told in order to build the intuition for what standpoint theory really is a story about factory workers and a foreman. So, the factory workers are working in a factory and they're led by the foreman. Now, the foreman knows what the foreman wants because he is the foreman. Um, but the foreman doesn't really know what the workers underneath him want, and he doesn't really care. All that really matters is that they do their work. Um, but the workers, on the other hand, the people who are being oppressed and being subjugated by the foreman, um, the people being exploited by him, these people, being workers, know what the workers want, but they also know what the foreman wants. They understand the foreman's point of view. They have what's called double vision. They understand their own point of view and they understand the point of view of the people who rule the world that they live in. And you can see how a certain type of feminism can lead to similar epistemology, except in the place of the workers, you have women, and in the place of the foremen, you have men. Um, and this is the basic idea behind Sandra Harding's epistemology, and was subsequently taken up by the most popular strand of feminism today, which is intersectionality. Standpoint theory, um, as I have described it, uh, is the epistemology of intersectionality. That's kind of the long and short of it.
So if I'm getting this right, it basically states that whoever is oppressed sort of has this advantage in being able to see, everybody's motivations, needs, and wants.
Yes, and this provides them with
Oh, you broke up.
Oh, I think
epistemology is sorry.
The last thing we heard was
Can you hear?
this provides them.
Sorry. My mic got disconnected. My bad. But yeah, there are several epistemologies that are relevant to the kinds of things that I discuss with regard to academia. Standpoint theory is among them. But what they all have in common is this idea that there's no such thing as objectivity in the sense that scientists think of objectivity. Objectivity is just a pretense. It's with the people in power express their point of view as though it were the truth, and then they cloak it with this pretension of objectivity, this fake objectivity, in order to deceive people into thinking that this way of thinking is the natural order rather than the bias of the people in charge.
Hmm.
how does this get translated into science? Isn't science objective?
Um, Most people would say yes. The feminist epistemologist, and more generally, the people who I characterize. Well, I should um, I should probably lay out what these epistemologies are. Broadly summarized, they constitute postmodern epistemologies, which is separate from standpoint theory, and standpoint theory, which is separate from the postmodern perspective. And together we can take them as the anti-objectivist epistemologies. So that's what we'll designate them. And in opposition to them, we'll have objectivist epistemologies of science. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I just wanted to make that partition clear.
Well, okay, I think you're starting to. So it seems to me that I would consider science to be objective, and it's measurable, and we can demonstrate it, we can measure it. How is anyone going to tell me that it's not objective?
Yeah. So basically, their notion is that science is a social institution, and being a social institution, it's subject to the same set of their presuppositions for how society works and how narratives are constructed, and how the superstructure, in Marxist terms, is developed. The people in power are the ones who get to say what is and isn't objective, and being critical theorists, and on the other side also being postmodernists, they're incredulous toward these stories of this is the natural order of things, this is objective, this is how it all works. They're saying no, this is just an expression of unjust power relations. This is people pretending that these things are objectively real when in fact it's just their own point of view. It's just their own socially situated perspective.
How do they get around, you can show that something is, testable, repeatable, observable. How do they get around that?
Well, they exploit some philosophy of science that was done back in the 60s and 70s, most notably the philosophy of science offered by Thomas Kuhn and Willard Quine. And I discussed these a little bit in my video, Is Science a Social Construct? And basically, if you look at the history of scientific knowledge, you have what are called paradigms. You have um, a certain set of background propositions that scientists accept, and they work within a certain theoretical framework. And as time goes on, this theoretical framework works fine for a certain set of problems. There exists what we might call a theory space, and a particular paradigm will occupy a portion of that theory space. Um, and as time goes on, this theory expands and it explains more and more phenomena, but eventually it reaches a kind of boundary of its applicability. It reaches points of theory space where it's no longer able to accurately predict and explain certain phenomena.
Mhm.
Um, and this results in anomalies. This results in the production of counterfactual evidence, the production of anomalies, and then eventually you have a crisis going. And scientists start frantically searching for some explanation, some more general model that's able to explain all of the old stuff and is also able to explain the new stuff as well. And eventually this happens and you get what's called a paradigm shift. Um, So, by the account of the anti-objectivists, social these paradigm shifts are fundamentally governed by differing social conditions from generation to generation. The physicist Max Planck uh, famously said, "Science advances one funeral at a time." The idea basically being that older scientists are so entrenched in their theoretical paradigms that eventually when contradictory evidence comes up, they're very reticent. They fight very hard against changing their views because that's basically what they made their careers off of. And then when they die and the younger scientists replace them, then they get to have their new ideas heard. And if you take this to a certain extreme, then it appears that science is fundamentally a function of what's fashionable. Um, so that's basically how they read Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn didn't actually mean it this way. He argued against this relativist view, but this is the view that frequently gets taught in the social science departments and in some history departments, as well as some philosophy departments. So that's unfortunate. Um, and they also abuse some ideas of the philosopher Willard Quine. So Quine, he was actually not the first person to come up with this. It was a philosopher named Duhem about 100 years, 50 to 100 years earlier, and this concerns something called underdetermination. And the basic idea is that within theory space, you have some set of propositions, some set of facts that can be arranged in a certain manner so as to explain a certain phenomenon. But there are many different ways you can arrange these facts. Some facts can be omitted, some can be emphasized more than others, some can be excluded altogether. And you can create potentially, excuse me, however many combinations of facts are possible, that's how many theories you can create in order to explain a particular phenomenon. So, to give an example of this kind of thing, a correlation between violence and aggressive behavior. If you have a single study and all you know about a relationship between violence or between violent video games and aggressive behavior is that there's a study that finds a correlation between the two, in principle, you can explain this correlation via a number of models, a number of theories. You can say that violent video games cause aggressive behavior. You can say that people who are aggressive will naturally tend toward violent video games. You can say that there is some third factor that is responsible for both, and the possibilities are basically endless. Um, so the idea that gets abused here is that because historically the people who have been constructing theories have been straight white men, um, the only kinds of theories that were created were the ones that were fashionable, going back to this paradigm shift, to straight white men. And that you have to, if you introduce the biases of people who are not white and people who are not men, um, then you can start exploring more and more of theory space, and eventually end up with a more complete set of scientific knowledge instead of this very supposedly myopic corner that is dominated by the white male perspective.
Is there, do you have a practical example of a specific complaint where it is said that the feminist view is superior to a model that's been that we currently use, or a way of looking at things that we've accepted?
Yes, one of the most famous claims concerns the manner in which sperm and egg um, come into union during reproduction. So, according to certain feminist scholars, and I'll be covering this in a future video, scientists have historically thought of sperm as basically being these explorers who are traveling into the vagina and who are bravely tackling these eggs, and the sperm are acting on the eggs. And then later on, it turned out, once you introduce some feminist biases, no, it's actually the case that the eggs are sending out these signals that are basically pulling these writhing, incompetent sperm toward them. The big, strong woman
Okay.
pulling her man in. Uh, and, uh, and while the science is true, the presentation of the history is not. You'll see frequently that there are omissions and distortions in their presentation of the history, the philosophy, and the science itself. And this is basically covered in what we've come to know as the science wars. Basically, scientists, scientifically um, the scientifically minded philosophers, mathematicians, engineers, they got tired of this shit. They got tired of seeing all of the shit scholarship that was misrepresenting and distorting the history, science, and the philosophy. And they got together and they started publishing book after book and article after article, basically showing that these anti objectivist objections were full of shit, that evidentially there was nothing to them. And this resulted in a lot of back and forth and a lot of vitriol in the academy between, I want to say, 1994 and 2004 or 2005.
Oh wow. So I assume that some of this has to still be going on.
Yes, it's my opinion that we are rapidly approaching a second science wars, a second set of science wars. And that it hasn't been formally recognized. You know, you've only seen little skirmishes here and there, like the grievance studies hoax, the so-called squared hoax, which, by the way, I participated in.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
yeah, it was I was initially, several months before it started, I sent out a message to a lot of people who I thought would be interested in participating in a massive hoax. Um, and the first person to get back to me was Helen Pluckrose. And I ultimately did not directly participate. I acted in a kind of advisory capacity. They consulted with my Science Wars videos, and I was in contact with James Lindsay, who was also part of that hoax, and he would periodically send me updates and say, "Hey, we published this hoax paper. Hey, we published that hoax paper." Things of that nature. So I was aware of this hoax. I was in an unofficial capacity a part of it, um, but I didn't write any of the stuff. I acted purely in a consulting capacity.
Oh wow.
But anyway, formally, I don't believe that the second science wars have begun, but I think it's only a matter of time. I think that there's a lot of tension right now between the humanities and the natural sciences, and there has to be some precipitating event that's going to cause that tension to break. I thought that Sokal Squared would do it. I was mistaken. I think that it will happen, but it's going to require something else. It's going to have to, the humanities are going to have to overstep more than they've already done. They're going to have to really piss off the scientists, and as soon as they do that, Science Wars 2 is on its way, and they're basically fucked. We fucked them over in the first Science Wars. This is not a fight that they won. They've been very careful, I want to say, not to overstep their bounds, but these people, their temperament, I don't think they have the self-control to continue in that vein. I do think they're going to overstep fairly soon, and I do think that it's going to result in terrible consequences for them.
What are the consequences of not opposing this and sort of saying, okay, you know, you can, we'll let you have your view, or we're not going to be vocal in opposition to you?
Well, we already have an idea of what sort of things happen when you ignore the science in favor of a certain ideological or personal predisposition. We have historical examples. We have the Challenger disaster, where the managers didn't listen to the engineers who told them that it wasn't safe to launch with these temperatures because of what they would do to the O-rings. They launched anyway because they wanted to stick to their launch schedule. They wanted to get funding for NASA, and then of course, six astronauts and one civilian among them died needlessly. Chernobyl, there's a wonderful miniseries on HBO by Craig Mazin that you should go check it out. That story is a story about how the Soviet Union uh, basically fucked people over by concealing the science and by subsequently lying to people about the extent of the damage caused by that incident. And of course, we have Lysenkoism, which I discuss quite a bit. We could talk about that too, if that comes up further.
Well, and you had mentioned, I would like to get, because I think there is one other precedent of this happening. Well, there's a couple, but former Soviet Russia that you had spoke about earlier too, where the sort of the paradigm of um, the or actually, it must have been. I would assume it was right before Soviet Russia, right before the revolution, the paradigm of the bourgeois versus the worker class. Can you talk a bit more about that and how that sort of maybe is a mirror to what's going on here?
Sure. In what sense? What specifically do you want to hear about it? The bourgeois versus worker class.
Well, how they the worker class was trying to, I guess, sort of control the the perspective of really of reality and how people were looking at it, and how that paradigm shift applies to what we're seeing here.
Well, I think what you're hinting at perhaps is Lysenkoism itself. So I guess I'll just talk about that. Um, so, as we all know, the former Soviet Union was ostensibly about glorifying the worker, and this includes glorifying the perspective of the worker and developing emancipatory science. Um, there's a wonderful book. I don't remember the author's name, but it's called Stalin and the Scientists, which talks about the way the kind of propaganda that science was placed in service of the scientists who were persecuted for having un-Soviet scientific results, things that contradicted the dominant ideology, and scientists who were pressured into falsifying results, like famously Pavlov. Um, his whole spiel was you could condition animals, so perhaps you could condition humans in a certain manner so that we can overthrow this bourgeois capitalist false consciousness that we've all been imbued with over the centuries. Um, they lean very heavily on Engel's theory of the formation of the family, for instance, and you read stories about how Stalin would try to force families to live together and function as a single unit, and basically remove the family bonds. But people wouldn't go with that. They would draw boundaries inside of these communal homes where their families lived, and they would sort of partition their own property. So there's you can't really socialize people in the manner that Pavlov, with some of these falsified studies or some of these fake studies, suggested. But this saw a much more tragic expression in the work of Trofim Lysenko. So Lysenko, um, he fit a certain demographic profile. When he didn't learn to read until he was 13 years old. He came from a very poor Ukrainian family, and eventually he became an agricultural scientist. And he had certain ideas that were flattering to the Soviet ideology. Um, most notably among them, close cropping. The idea was that instead of natural selection, organisms engage in natural cooperation, which to some degree is true among social species. But the way Lysenko thought of it was you could take seeds for crops, you could plant them very closely together, and in this manner you could invest the minimum amount of water and the minimum amount of soil. And what the seeds would do is they would evenly distribute the nutrients in the soil and the water that they were given, basically mimicking the Soviet system of equal distribution, helping their comrade seeds. And this would result in maximum crop yields with a minimum input of resources. Uh, and the policy was first put into effect in 1932. And what happened from there is history. In conjunction with Stalin's collectivization policies, this resulted in the immediate death of 7 million Ukrainians, a total of 10 million across the Soviet Union. This was over the course of a single year. 10 million dead because of a conjunction of Lysenkoism and Stalin's collectivization policies. These were the people who starved to death. These weren't the people who were taken to the gulag. These weren't the people who were shot. These are people who simply starved to death. They didn't have enough food.
So it sounds like you're saying there's consequences to eroding the foundation of science and its
Of
principles.
course.
Yeah,
Of course. How could there not be?
yeah.
Well, it's not just that, but it sounds like almost using um, sort of either intuition or, sort of, well, in my life, I've noticed that, socialism works well, so it must also work well for crops. And then you supplant that for the science, and I mean, I've said this before in other contexts, especially usually when talking about religion, where a bad answer is worse than no answer at all. I mean, if you sit there and say, I don't know how best to optimize crops. It's probably best to just do the old method as opposed to coming up with a wild guess that could wipe everything out.
Yes. I see Smitty has a question in the comments. He says, I don't see how science is anti-worker. So certain scientific results were perceived as being anti-worker. So, for example, Lysenko denied the existence of genes, and he called them, and I quote directly, a bourgeois construct. And the reason why he rejected it was because genes supposedly, in his mind, offered a justification for the status quo, justification for stratified society. People who are in the upper classes are there because they have superior genes. People who are in the lower classes are there because they have inferior genes. This is the natural order of things. And of course, this contradicts Soviet ideology. Another example,
So it's almost
natural selection.
I was gonna say it's almost
Sorry, go
the
ahead.
exact opposite of what's the why can't I think of the word right now? The Nazi idea of people are naturally certain people are naturally superior. And if you just keep killing off all the inferior people, eventually you'll it's like the polar opposite, the polar extreme of that.
Yes, I think it's correct to observe. It's a good observation that Lysenkoism and eugenics both
Yes.
occupy the extremes of the same spectrum, and both of them lead, of course, to terrible results.
Yeah.
I had heard somewhere, and I thought this was interesting, and this is a bit of an aside, but just to get as to how extreme these views can get, because this was really shocking. Somebody had referred to, and it was a feminist epistemologist had said that Newton's work was, and do you know the rest of that quote?
Yes. Let me try to remember it. It was Sandra Harding's 1986 book,
Yes.
"The Science Question in Feminism." In fact, this was the quote that won a special place in the heart of every physicist who ever heard of Sandra Harding. And the quote goes something along the lines of, "Is it not appropriate to refer to Newton's laws as Newton's rape manual?"
Newton's rape manual.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and this,
And for
please,
people
Ansgar.
listening, what is Newton raping?
Nature. By subjugating nature, by binding her and forcing mankind's will upon her, we have raped nature. This by her reckoning was the intention of science from the time of Bacon, and my videos discuss how this view came to be formed and how this view is the result of quote mining, of dishonest appraisal, very hostile quote mining of Francis Bacon. Searching for the one time he said something that was a little bit sideways, and then combining it with a metaphor he once made about marriage, and then putting the two together to make it seem like science was a marriage between humanity and nature, but an abusive kind of marriage where humanity would have his way with nature. That's basically the long and short of it, and it's still taught to this day. If you look at syllabi in courses on feminist epistemology, Sandra Harding is standard reading. Other people, Carolyn Merchant, who first came out with this crap. She didn't come out with the rape manual quote, but she came out with this false allegation against Bacon back in 1980 in her book The Death of Nature. Her work is taught. Evelyn Fox Keller, who repeated this nonsense, her work is still taught. This shit has been repeated for decades, even though it has been refuted for decades, and nobody is held accountable.
But what is the recourse that they would like to see? What do they say is the solution to this?
The solution is to introduce a new type of science, one that takes feminine biases into account. And what this basically means is the pushing to the side any theories that are, regardless of how well they work, pushing off to the side any theories that seem to contradict emancipatory politics, and propping up any theory that furthers emancipatory politics, whether it's true or not. Sandra Harding, another quote from her is, "Science is politics by other means." fundamentally, they don't see science as a means of acquiring truth. They see it as a bully pulpit. They see it as a means of consolidating the authority to say what's true and what isn't true.
Oh my, that she's quoting on Clausewitz. That's politics is war by is war by other means. Oh my God.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the quotes that I shouldn't say quote. One of the things that I hear a lot, and this is the one of the things that really irks me, and it comes up in your Science Wars videos, which by the way, I suggest everyone go watch his Science Wars videos. In fact, all of his videos. But yes,
before we go any further, what's your YouTube channel? Because absolutely this, yes,
it's
go
linked in the description.
subscribe.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Have him say it anyway. What's your YouTube channel?
King Crocoduck.
Oh well, that was complicated. I'm glad I stopped for that. All right, never mind.
Yeah. So one of the things that I hear a lot, and it was one of the first things that like kind of was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Is the notion that somebody's personal experiences, their personal perspective, their quote unquote lived experience is just as valuable, if not more so, than the scientific method.
Yes, and this ties back to a standpoint theory. It's fundamentally a phenomenological theory. It's a theory that emanates from the study of the structure of consciousness, if such a thing can be studied. Um, and the basic idea is that since science is ostensibly a product of straight white male biases, the result of straight white male lived experiences, we have to supplant that now with the lived experiences of other people and use other types of people and use that as the basis for science. Um, of course, people who are situated differently in their perspective are people who are going to have different lived experiences and consequently are going to produce different types of theory.
I mean, by that logic, couldn't anyone just claim pretty much anything? Well, ghosts are real because I had an experience. I mean, doesn't that completely destroy the ability uh to test a shared reality?
Or also
Yes,
just quickly add like black science as well, then, or Asian science. I mean, is that a
yes,
fair
yes.
extension?
These are all things. Afro mathematics, feminist biology. These I'm not making this up. These are real things. These are things that you're going to find in curricula, uh, often in the city of Berkeley, uh, and um, you can. I read this ridiculous paper called "Towards a Feminist Algebra," um, and I it warrants its own video, but it's the saddest paper I've ever read. If we could dignify it by calling it a paper. Um,
I have to know what Afro mathematics even is. I I that
Afro, Afro, Afro mathematics are exactly what they sound like. They're mathematics, but from an African perspective, discussing the kinds of mathematics that are of interest to Black people. And of course, because the people who create this kind of curricula, they have a very shallow understanding of mathematics. What they think this means, what they think this ultimately amounts to, is word problems that are of interest. Instead of saying Ben and Jack have 4 marbles, Jack runs away with 2 marbles. How many marbles are left? It's Jamal and Tyrone have 6 marbles, and blah 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 blah. You replace white-sounding names with black-sounding names. You replace male names with female names, or sorry, men's names with women's names. And questions where the context is the person is a scientist or a CEO. It's going to be a woman. It's going to be a person of color. That kind of name is going to suggest that. And a problem concerning, say, let's say two people want to you want to do a math problem involving compound interest, right? To teach people about geometric growth. Say two people want to take out a mortgage on a house, and the interest there's compound interest. You instead of saying it's Jack and Mary, you say it's something progressive like I don't know Lily and Mary, and supposedly this is going to make people more accepting of whatever. I don't buy that this is actually how it works. I don't think it makes a difference either way. Fundamentally, the point of mathematics pedagogy is to help students overcome these kinds of distractions, to weed out the irrelevant information, like who's buying, or what
Hmm.
the marriage arrangements of the people who are exchanging marbles is. The point is, these are the variables at play. You have to know how to manipulate these variables, and everything else is noise. But like I said, these people have a very shallow understanding of mathematics. They have an even more shallow understanding of mathematics pedagogy, and the result is students end up suffering when this kind of
Hmm.
curriculum gets adopted.
Kitty makes a good point. I mean, if so your lived experiences are now science, then I guess that completely validates anti-vaxxers. In my experience, the vaccination caused autism, therefore vaccines cause autism.
Well, they're very selective. They're very selective with regard to what they're prepared to accept.
Hmm.
It's not even the case that if you're a black anti-vaxxer or a black female lesbian anti-vaxxer that they're going to take you seriously. Um, the perspective that they're going to validate is not the woman's perspective, but the feminist perspective. So if a dissident woman comes
Mm.
up and she says, "It's my lived experience that things are created and don't evolve," um, they're not going to take that seriously, because that's not the feminist perspective. That's just one woman's perspective, and she's laboring under false consciousness. They have this kind of safeguards in place where they don't have to subscribe to whatever theories they don't want to. Their framework is just flexible enough to admit whatever they want, but not so flexible so as to include things that they don't want. And of course, they get to decide when to admit such and such crackpot theory and when to exclude other crackpot or alternatively not crackpot theories that are good, theories that work.
That actually brings up a really important question for me, anyways. So, science as it is now has a system, right, for determining who should get to say what is, our current scientific understanding and what it gets rejected. It's built right into the scientific method. What does that for, this new feminist epistemology? Who gets to decide
Oh,
what
yeah.
is a valid theory, and what isn't? Is that baked into the epistemology?
Well, fundamentally, these things get decided in literature, and of course, because this is decided, by a community of scholars, you can get massive controversies like what you have going on right now between radical feminists and the so-called gender critical feminists and trans activists.
Hmm.
Um, and that's a whole separate interesting discussion. But both think that the other side is an agent of the heteronormative patriarchy.
Okay.
So they're not able to really distinguish friend from foe in this regard, and it's caused a massive civil war inside of feminism, because their epistemology is shit. They have no means of distinguishing fact from fiction.
Right.
It's only what's politically convenient versus what's politically inconvenient. Kelly Oliver of Vanderbilt University, she wrote in one of her papers, trying to remember the quote. The goal of feminist theory should not be to develop true theories or false theories. The goal of feminist theory should be to develop strategic theories. Um,
Jesus.
this is all documented in my Science War series. You can see the actual paper. I put it there. I highlighted the part where she said this, where all of this is said. The rate manual stuff, everything that I said. It's in the Science War series. It's not just my word of mouth. You can look at the paper. I've cited it. I have this is like over 200 citations in total that are referenced. There's some of my best referenced videos. Anyone can look. They can verify for themselves that I'm not making this shit up, and that these people have thousands of citations. They get accolades, they get awards. They're at prestigious universities. Some of them are department heads. This is a major problem.
Well, yeah, okay. So you just leaned right into what I was about to ask. You said this is a major problem. I wonder how much is this just a bunch of crackpots that everyone's going to ignore and nobody cares about, versus people who are a genuine threat to the sort of the institution of science and how it is practiced and really what makes it work at a minimum in this country. Where does it stand on that spectrum?
Um, Well, the people who are pushing this kind of crap occupy very high status positions at prestigious institutions. Evelyn Fox Keller is at MIT. Sandra Harding is at UCLA. Kelly Oliver is at Vanderbilt. Uh, Donna Haraway is at UC Santa Cruz. Donna Riley is at Purdue. She's the head of the engineering education department at Purdue, and she thinks that engineers should get rid of linearity, superposition, and rigor from their curriculum. It's
Wait,
in the textbook that she
what?
wrote. We should get rid of rigor from our curriculum, because if you deconstruct the word rigor in the way that she thinks you should deconstruct it, it fundamentally means masculine bias. So we should get rid of rigor from engineering. She's the head of the engineering department at our engineering education department at Purdue.
Oh boy,
I feel
I'm not
safe.
sure whether to laugh or cry. Really.
And of course, you can bet that this has had effects. There was a drug called Addy. I don't know if you heard about this. But basically, there's a problem where there's a disproportionate amount of solutions for male libido problems versus female libido problems. So if a man is having trouble getting an erection, he has a lot of options. Whereas if a woman is having trouble getting sexually aroused, she doesn't have that many options medically. And this is seen by activists as some kind of injustice. Fundamentally, it comes down to differences in physiology between male and female sexuality. If in order for a man to get an erection, you just need blood flowing through the penis. That can easily be accomplished by things like Viagra. Whereas with women, it's fundamentally psychological, and that's not quite as easy to deal with.
Well, and let's not point out that there's a very big difference between where does the money go and where are we driving the science, which is a social, that's decided by economics, politics, many social factors, obviously, but the science is still the science, right?
Yeah, but you're going to want to hear about this Addy thing, because this really shows how much pull they actually have. So one of the scientists at Vanderbilt University, she's laboring under I don't know if she's a scientist or she's a clinician. I think she's a researcher, and she's laboring under this kind of epistemological nonsense, this Lysenkoist epistemology. And she argued in multiple articles that the failure to approve of the FDA to approve of this drug called Addy was fundamentally the result of men trying to control women's sexuality. That the FDA needed to approve it because this is going to help with women's emancipation. So this drug Addy, it doesn't work as intended. It doesn't it doesn't produce. It gives, like, I think maybe 1 in every 3 or 4 months. It will increase the number of sexual experiences that women will be able to have. Let me think. But aside from that, it doesn't really do anything. And in conjunction with alcohol, it causes people to black out. So functionally, Addy is effectively a date rape drug.
Oh my God.
And they
Jesus.
so these articles started coming out. National Organization of Women came behind it, and the pharmaceutical company conspired with National Organization of Women and the scientist at Vanderbilt, who was laboring under this kind of epistemology. They pushed this drug onto the FDA, said, okay, you're going to approve of this drug or we're going to call you sexist. We don't care if it fails at clinical trials. We don't care if the overwhelming majority of people, or I think almost exclusively the people who this drug was tested on, were men, who notably don't suffer from female libido problems, but putting that off to the side. They said, you're going to approve this drug or we're going to continue putting out these hit pieces after hit pieces calling you a sexist. And it's all fundamentally done on these grounds of emancipatory epistemology. And of course, the drug came out. Addy was legalized for several months, but then there was a recall after that because reality caught up, and the FDA didn't want to be held liable for what was fundamentally this clusterfuck. It's currently legal in Canada, and who knows what kind of havoc it's wreaking. This date rape drug that's being marketed as libido facilitator.
Oh.
Uh,
Oh wow. Okay.
well,
So
that happens.
so the in the name of emancipatory science, a drug was approved that shouldn't have been approved and then had to be recalled because it was basically nothing but a glorified date rape drug. That's
Yes.
I mean, you can't get much more real world than that. Um wow.
No, well, how could you say no when you have someone from Vanderbilt, when you have
Mhm.
people from Purdue, from UCLA, from MIT who are getting behind this shit? Um, and of course, the consequences are going to manifest. Today, it's date rape drugs. Tomorrow, I get critics all the time on my Science Wars videos, as I do with my other videos, and they say this isn't a big deal. This is just a few crazies. It's just a few cuckoos, just a few lunatics. You don't need to worry about them. And I showed them, look at these articles that I'm citing. They have thousands of citations. Look at the positions held by the people who have written and continue to write this crap. They occupy prestigious positions at prestigious universities. Look at the effect of Addy. Um, I don't know what I have to show you short of an actual famine to convince you to take this problem seriously. But some people they want to stick their head in the sand and it's embarrassing because their politics are adjacent to whatever politics are driving this new Lysenkoism, and they feel that if they or come out against it, there's a certain degree of fear associated with this. Who wants to come out in public and say we are against feminist science? To the general public, that sounds like we don't want women in science, or we don't want people of color in science. And this discussion has been going on now for what we've been talking for 50 minutes. Um, who's going to sit down and look at this evidence for however many hours you need to look at it and come to an informed conclusion? My videos on the Science Wars are not my most popular videos by any means. They only get together, they have less than 100,000 views, I think. I think maybe they have about 100,000, but they're not by any means my most popular videos. My most popular videos get views in the millions, and those just concern general science. This is not something people are terribly interested in, and that's a shame. People are partly because they're scared about confronting this kind of thing. They're scared of the cognitive dissonance, and partially, I suspect, because they're afraid of reprisal from their progressive associates.
Well, this brings me to a comment and then a question. So, the other thing that I think should be considered is certainly if they're in teaching positions. I mean, science is science, and it sounds like they're not practicing science. They're just not. And if they're in a teaching position, then they have a great influence over um, their students, and it's a lot of students over 2, 3, 4, 10, 15-year period. And these are students too that I would imagine have to learn to adapt to this methodology, at least for that class, if they're going to get a passing grade. And that I think has a tremendous long-term impact on our ability to do science. But let me ask you this: how do these people get these positions at these universities?
Um, So that's a very good question, and it actually ties into several economic questions concerning the corporatization of the university, how private interests are deciding what gets funded and how the university is going to be represented and how the university is going to be branded. The universities now get effectively corporate branding. They have mission statements. Um, and of course, a big part of corporate politics is public relations. You want to be seen as being down with the kids. You want to be hip. You want to be you want to be corporatized, and this includes always this commitment to diversity and inclusion, which is a fine commitment. Um, but this comes at the expense of academic standards, and because these private interests, these chair people of the universities, they're making 400, 500, $700,000 a year. They don't give a shit about academics. They care about lining their pockets and having as little trouble as possible on their campuses. So they're going to appease these extremes in order to make it appear as though they support this progressive and inclusive agenda. um, but in reality, I think fundamentally it's cynical careerism that's allowing this kind of advancement to take place. And it's going to cost the university dearly. It's ironic. The far left is aligning itself with corporate interests in what might be the most cynical alliance since the Nazi Soviet non aggression pact.
Blue Horizons has sort of a question. Says, can you talk about your predictions for the science wars in the academy and how it may affect the humanities?
I think one of two things is going to happen within the next 20 years. I think either the universities are going to die, they're effectively going to become glorified diploma mills. The part of the corporatization process is costs are being cut, corners are being cut. And for example, in one of the labs that I teach, ordinarily in a physics lab, you're supposed to, learn physics. You're supposed to work with physical objects and see how they respond to certain variables. You pull a pendulum this far on a string this length, and then you see how it oscillates, and you make measurements and use those measurements to develop an equation, which you can then make predictions with. Blah 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 blah. They are this year at my university. They're currently phasing this out and replacing it with computer simulations, with the ultimate goal of making it so that you no longer need to teach labs, no longer need to have people teaching these labs. You don't need to pay people, you don't need to pay for equipment. All you need to pay for is the software, and students will be able to complete these labs and get their course credit from home. Um, and of course, this has a if you're going to be learning physics, you shouldn't be using simulations on a computer. You should actually be seeing the physics. But the upper management doesn't care. They want to cut costs, and this is the kind of shit that they pull. Um, so and this is happening across all of the departments. This kind of corner cutting, this kind of degradation of education. It's devaluing the value of a degree. You have computer science students will go into interviews, and because they've been copying, because they've been cheating for the 4 years on their online exams and whatever other cutting business has been in place. When they go into the interviews and they're asked to demonstrate some of their coding prowess, create a program for us in this language that can do such and such function using this much memory and do it in this much time. They can't do it. Even basic shit, because they cheated their way through it, and they were able to cheat their way through it because this kind of corner cutting was in place. And that's going to devalue the degrees. That's going to make it more difficult for people to find jobs, because now I heard it said, I don't know how popular this opinion is, but I've heard it said that the bachelor's degree is the new high school diploma. You have kind of credential inflation taking place, I guess you might say. So one possible outcome, which the science wars are peripheral to, or is that the academy is going to die. And it's going to die before too much damage can be done in this direction. And all science will be privatized. All scientists are going to move into the private sector. And the private sector, if they want to receive funds, they have to actually produce results, which means that they can't make use of this shit epistemology. And that's one way that the problem would correct itself, but the universities would die in the process. The other thing that could happen, it might be the case that the universities course correct from their current corporatization, and that they continue to survive, but then you have this attempted a hostile takeover of the sciences by certain sectors of the humanities, and eventually you do have a full-blown science wars that could have all manner of effects. I think fundamentally scientists would win the science wars. I think fundamentally truth would prevail at the end of the day. But it would come at a great pedagogical cost, and I do think that the humanities would suffer particularly for it. They're already their credibility is already in terrible decline. You'll hear from every humanities person, the humanities are under attack. Humanities are under attack, and it might seem like whining and whinging, but it really is. They do have a lot of problems in terms of outside perception and their ability to gain funding and things of that sort. And it's only going to be made worse if the humanities present themselves in this anti-science fashion. I do think it'll also have bad knock-on effects in the long term for science education. But I'm not very optimistic. Regardless of what the scenario is, I'm not optimistic about the future. I think that much worse things are headed our way.
Oh, wow.
All right, we have a few questions and comments from the GDC that I've been sort of letting accrue here. Most of them was actually just compliments for your performance. It says King Crocoduck obliterated Ray Comfort years ago, a must watch. Also, King Crocoduck must watch versus Kent Hovind, which I just did a debate against Kent Hovind. So but at this point, it's like, who hasn't? And then there was a question here. Do you think that soft humanities, i.e. gender studies, qualifies as a science?
Absolutely not.
Oh, that was a
that was
unequivocal.
easy and
That was
succinct. I like it.
Yep. Now I do think, unless Ansgar,
we have one.
so after,
we have one more question over
Perfect.
here. Trevor Lunn wants to know: is there anything similar to these science wars within ostensibly religious colleges and universities in the United States?
This is a good question. So within religious universities, they have their own kind of ecosystem in the same way that this subset of humanities have their own ecosystem. They're kind of insulated from the rest of the academy. I know a little bit less about how it happens with religious stuff, but basically, in order to counteract this fear from suburban households of their children coming back as indoctrinated communists who have the erection of these traditionalist Christian college schools, and this provides the fair and balanced counterbalance. And from this kind of institution, you get the William Lane Craigs of the world, and that kind of speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah, it kind of does. Yeah. That's it. That's it on this side.
All right. Well, what I think this is just a perfect time. We're at about the hour mark. So what I think we're going to do is, there's a lot of people who seem to want to chat with you. So if you're willing to join us at least for a little while, I'm going to get the after show up and running. So we're gonna sort of reset everything here, reset the streams. The after show should be up in about 5, maybe 10 minutes. If you want to join us, is the only way through the Discord, or can they do it through the chat too? Are people going to be dropping the Discord links, Ansgar?
Usually we do it exclusively through the Discord. It makes it easier for Dave to sort of vet questions and get in contact with people and help them into the room.
All right, perfect. So Kitty is going to be in the live chat. Dave will probably be in the live chat, or both of them may be also in the, but they'll be helping out. And if you don't have the Discord information, we will be dropping that in the description and in the live chat. This will only be on the In Time channel. We're not going to simulcast it. So if you're on the GDC right now, and if you want to participate, join us on In Time Show on YouTube, and we'd love to have you. So like I said, probably just about 10 minutes, and we'll be back up on the after show. Anyone who wants to join us. So
and I'd like
thank
to
you
add,
very much.
I just want to add real quick, if you search In Time on YouTube, we're just like the third result down after that famous movie. And I do want to say that we only covered an hour of an incredibly complex subject. So please, even if you're not coming to the after show, go to King Crocoduck's channel, check out his series, The Science Wars. You can just click the playlist tab, it'll be there, and then check out the rest of his content, because he does superb content. Superb.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We were really looking forward to this. So
truly honored.
Thank you, and we will see you guys all in about 10 minutes.